He thought his twins could feel nothing, until the maid whispered a name only they reacted to. Before anyone in Seoul dared to question Kang Jae-hyun, before the whispers about his empire and the silence that followed his footsteps, there was a room at the very top of his mansion where even power held no authority. A room filled with soft white light, expensive machines, and a silence so deep it pressed against the chest like weight. And inside that room lay his two children, born into a world of wealth, but trapped in bodies that never responded, never cried, never reached back there. Small fingers resting motionless against silk sheets that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Their eyes open but distant, as if they were watching something no one else could see. And for 2 years, the most feared man in South Korea had poured everything he had into changing that reality. Flying in specialists from New York, Los Angeles, and Boston. Men and women with degrees framed in gold and voices full of confidence that faded within days. Machines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars humming beside cribs that never needed rocking. Therapy scheduled down to the minute. Every possible treatment attempted with ruthless precision. Yet nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever made those children respond. Not to sound, not to touch, not even to him, their father, the man who could command entire rooms in a silence with a glance. And so the rule had been set with finality. No staff were allowed inside that room. No one untrained, no one unapproved, because hope had become something dangerous in that house, something that cost too much and delivered too little. And that was why when I first heard the faint sound from behind the closed door, she froze, her hands still damp from polishing marble floors that reflected chandeliers like frozen stars. She had only been in the mansion for 6 days, long enough to understand that invisibility was survival, that people like her moved quietly, spoke only when spoken to, and never crossed invisible lines, especially not the ones guarded by silence and unspoken fear. But the sound came again, not a cry, not exactly, more like a breath caught between worlds, and something inside her shifted, something she couldn't ignore, even though every rule told her to walk away. And for a moment she stood there, heart beating faster than it should, listening to the stillness that followed, wondering if she had imagined it, wondering if this was the kind of mistake that ended jobs or worse. And then she reached for the handle, her fingers trembling just slightly as the cool metal pressed in her skin. And when the door opened, the room greeted her not with chaos, but with quiet perfection. Everything arranged with clinical precision. Everything untouched. And there they were, the twins, exactly. As she had heard in whispers, lying side by side, unmoving, eyes open but empty. And for a second, she couldn't breathe because she had seen something like this before. Not here, not in a place like this, but somewhere far away, in a life that had taught her to recognize the difference between silence and being unheard. And slowly, without thinking, she stepped closer, the soft carpet swallowing the sound of her footsteps. Her eyes fixed on their faces, searching for something, anything. And then she leaned down just slightly, her voice barely more than air as it slipped into the stillness, not a song. Not yet, but a whisper, a name spoken as if it belonged to them, a name no one had ever told her. And in that moment, something changed, something so small it could have been missed, a flicker so brief it could have been dismissed. But it was there, and somewhere behind her, unseen, a pair of eyes had just witnessed everything. And for the first time in years, Kang Jae-hyun did not move, did not speak, because what he had just seen did not make sense, and yet he could not look away. For a man who controlled entire districts with a single phone call, Kang Jae-hyun had learned to trust only what could be measured, proven, and repeated, and yet what he had just witnessed inside that room refused to fit into any system he understood. His body remained still in the shadow of the doorway, his presence unnoticed, his breath slower than usual, as if even the air itself might disturb whatever fragile moment was unfolding before him. The maid stood beside the twins with her head slightly lowered, her posture careful, respectful, but there was something else in the way she leaned closer, something that did not belong to fear or obedience, something quieter, steadier. And when she spoke again, her voice was soft enough that most people would have missed it, but not him, Not today, because every instinct in him had sharpened the second he saw that movement, that impossible, almost invisible response from a child who had never reacted before. She whispered another name. Different this time, as if she were testing a memory rather than calling for attention, and again the room held its breath. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The filtered light from the tall windows painted everything in pale gold. And then it happened. Not a full movement, not something dramatic, but undeniable. One of the twins blinked slower than before, not the automatic reflex the doctors had explained so many times, but something that lingered just a fraction longer, as if the world had suddenly become worth noticing, and Kang Ji-hyun felt something tighten in his chest, something unfamiliar, something he had spent years avoiding by replacing it with control and certainty. Hope, dangerous and uninvited, and he stepped forward without realizing it. The soft sound of his shoe against the floor enough to break the fragile stillness. The maid froze instantly, her body stiffening, her hands pulling back as if she had been caught doing something forbidden, which she had. And when she turned, her eyes met his, wide but not panicked. Not completely. There was fear there, yes, but it was layered with something else. Something that did not collapse under his presence the way most people did. And that alone made him pause. His voice when it came was low, controlled, but quieter than anyone in his world had ever heard it. "What are you doing?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it filled the room. The kind of question that usually demanded immediate apology, immediate retreat, but she did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced back at the twins, as if making sure they were still there, still connected to whatever invisible thread she had found. And then she spoke, her words careful, each one placed with intention. "I'm talking to them, sir." The answer should have sounded naive, even foolish, but it did not. Not after what he had seen. His eyes shifted to the children, searching for proof that he had imagined it, that exhaustion or frustration had created something that was not real, but the faint change in their expression, the subtle difference in the way their bodies rested against the sheets, it remained small but present, and his mind began to race through explanations, neurological anomalies, delayed responses, coincidence, anything that could restore order to the moment. But none of it aligned with what he had witnessed seconds earlier. And when he looked back at her, really looked this time, he saw details he had never noticed before. The slight tremble in her fingers, the way she stood not as someone defying him, but as someone protecting something fragile. The quiet determination in her eyes that did not match the uniform she wore. And for the first time since she had entered his house, she was no longer invisible. "How do you know those names?" he asked, his voice sharper now. Not from anger, but from the need to understand, because those names had never been spoken outside this room. Not to staff, not to anyone. They were names he had chosen in private. Names that belonged only to his children. And yet she had said them as if they were familiar, as if she had always known them. And the silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, heavy with implication, because whatever answer she gave next would either restore his world to what it was before, or change it in ways he was not prepared for. The question hung in the air like something fragile that could shatter if touched too roughly. And for a moment, Mai did not move, her eyes lowering not in submission but in thought, as if she were searching for the right way to explain something that did not belong in a place like this, a place built on certainty and control. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the faint tremor still there, but her voice when it came was steady. Softer than before, but clearer. "I did not know their names, sir, not at first." And the answer alone was enough to tighten the tension in the room, because it did not answer anything. It only deepened the question. Kang Ji-hyun's gaze sharpened, his posture still composed, but no longer distant. He stepped closer now, not enough to intimidate, but enough to close the space between them, enough to see her expression without distance. Then how he asked, and there was something different in his tone. Not anger, not yet, but something more dangerous, curiosity, the kind that did not accept vague answers. Mai glanced back at the twins again, her eyes softening in a way that did not match the rigid perfection of the room. And when she spoke, it was slower, as if each word had weight. "I listened," she said, and the simplicity of it made no sense at all. His brow tightened slightly. Listening to what? The machines, the silence. the frustration that had filled this room for years, but she shook her head. Gently, no, sir, not that. And then she stepped closer to the crib again, her movements careful, respectful, as if she were asking permission from the children rather than from him. I listened to them. The statement should have sounded impossible, and yet the evidence stood right in front of him, small, undeniable changes that his mind could not dismiss. His eyes followed her as she leaned down again, not touching, not forcing, only speaking, her voice dropping into that same soft tone, almost like a conversation meant for someone sitting beside her rather than lying still before her. You do not have to be quiet anymore, she whispered, and something in the room shifted again, not visible, not measurable, but present, the kind of change that could only be felt, and Kang Ji-hyun felt it, whether he wanted to or not, his chest tightening again as his thoughts moved faster, searching for logic, for explanation, for anything that would return control to his world. But control was slipping, slowly, quietly, in a way that did not ask for permission, and then he saw it again, clearer this time. One of the twins' fingers curled just slightly, not a reflex, not random, but as if responding to something familiar, and his breath caught, just for a second, just long enough to break the rhythm he had built his life around. He had seen reports, studies, false hopes presented as breakthroughs, but this was different, because it was happening in front of him, without equipment, without protocols, without the expensive certainty he had relied on for years. And when he looked back at Mai, something inside him shifted, not trust, not yet, but recognition that she was standing in a place no one else had been able to reach, and that alone made her dangerous in a way he did. Not understand. You expect me to believe that, he said quietly, his voice no longer cold but restrained, as if he were holding something back. And she met his gaze again, this time without lowering her eyes, not challenging him, but not retreating either. I do not expect anything, sir, she replied. I only did not want them to be alone, and the words landed harder than anything else she had said, because in a house filled with people, with staff, with security, with endless movement and order, the idea that his children had been alone, truly alone, was something he had never allowed himself to consider. And for the first time, the silence in the room felt different, not empty, but heavy with something he had avoided for 2 years, something that could not be fixed with money or power. And as he stood there, watching the smallest movement from children who had never responded before, he realized that whatever was happening in this room, it was no longer something he could ignore. And, for the first time in a long time, Kang Jae-hyun did not know what to do next. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something long buried beginning to surface, and Kang Ji-hyun stood there with a stillness that no longer came from control but from uncertainty, his eyes moving between the twins and the woman standing beside them, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that refused to align, one built on years of evidence, medical reports, failed treatments, and quiet acceptance, and the other unfolding right in front of him, fragile, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but carried weight, the kind that signaled a decision forming, not complete, not yet, but moving in a direction he had not allowed before. Then he spoke, not as a command, not as a threat, but as something unfamiliar even to himself. Do it again. The words were simple, but the room seemed to react to them, the air tightening slightly, the machines continuing their steady rhythm, as if unaware of the shift taking place. Mai hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of defiance, but out of awareness. She understood the gravity of what he was asking, because this was no longer about curiosity, this was about proof, about whether what had just happened could happen again. And slowly, she nodded, turning back toward the twins with the same careful presence she had shown before, her movements deliberate, unhurried, as if rushing would break something invisible. She stepped closer, lowering herself slightly so that her voice would not have to travel far. And once again, she spoke, not louder, not more confident, but consistent, as if she were continuing a conversation that had never been interrupted. You are not alone, she whispered, and Kang Ji-hyun watched. Every detail sharpened in his perception, The angle of her shoulders, the rhythm of her breathing, the stillness of the children, his mind cataloging everything, searching for patterns, for any indication that this was chance, that it could be explained away. Seconds passed, stretching longer than they should, and for a moment, doubt began to creep back in, quiet but persistent, until it happened again, clearer this time, when the twins' hands shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from across the room, but enough that it could not be dismissed, enough that it broke something inside him that had been locked in place for 2 years. His fingers tightened at his sides, not in anger, but in restraint, because reacting too quickly might shatter the moment. And he had learned, through loss and failure, that fragile things did not survive force. His gaze moved to the other twin, watching, waiting, and then, as if following an unspoken cue, a single tear formed at the corner of the child's eye, slowly tracing a path down skin that had never responded before. And that was the moment everything changed, not because of the movement itself, but because of what it meant, because tears required feeling, and feeling meant presence. And presence meant that somewhere inside the silence, his children had been there all along. And Kang Jae-hyun felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time, not fully, not yet, but enough to make his chest tighten and his breath falter for a brief, unguarded second. He turned his head slightly, breaking his gaze just long enough to regain control. But when he looked back, the world had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. The maid was no longer just a presence in his house. She was now a variable he could not ignore, a factor that disrupted everything he thought he understood. And that realization carried weight, because in his world, anything that disrupted control demanded a response. Yet this time, the response did not come as an order or a dismissal. Instead, it came as something quieter, more deliberate. "You will come back here tonight," he said, his voice steady again, but different, less distant, less absolute. And when I looked at him, there was no surprise in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if she had already understood that this moment would lead to another. And as Kang Ji-hyun turned toward the door, pausing just briefly before stepping out, he realized that for the first time in years, he was not leaving that room with certainty. He was leaving it with something far more dangerous, something he could not control, and something he could not ignore: hope. That night did not arrive the way nights usually did in Kang Ji-hyun's mansion. It did not settle quietly over polished marble and glass, nor did it bring the predictable rhythm of routine. Instead, it carried a tension that moved through the halls like something unseen, something waiting. And even the staff seemed to feel it without understanding why. Their voices lower, their footsteps softer, as if the house itself were holding its breath. And in the highest room, where the lights never fully dimmed, the twins lay exactly as they always had, still and silent beneath the soft glow of carefully controlled warmth, the machines beside them humming with quiet precision. But something about the room felt different now, not in its appearance, but in its expectation, because for the first time in 2 years, there was something to wait for. And Kang Ji-hyun stood just outside the door, his hand resting lightly against the frame, not entering immediately, not because he hesitated out of fear, but because he understood that whatever was about to happen inside could not be forced, and forcing things had always been his instinct, his advantage, his identity. Yet this was different. This required restraint, something far more difficult than control. And when he finally stepped inside, his presence was quieter than usual, his gaze immediately drawn to the cribs, searching for any sign that the day had not been imagined, that the fragile shift he had witnessed still existed. And, for a moment, everything looked the same, unchanged, untouched, the twins lying still, their expressions distant, and the doubt returned, subtle but persistent, until he heard the soft sound of the door behind him closing, and he turned to see Mai standing there, her posture composed, her expression calm in a way that did not challenge his authority, but did not shrink from it either. She had come as he asked, without hesitation, without question, and that alone set her apart from everyone else in his world. "You remember what you did," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement that carried expectation, and she nodded slightly. her eyes moving past him to the children, as if they were the only ones who truly mattered in this room. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, and there was no performance in her tone, no attempt to impress or defend, only certainty, and that certainty unsettled him more than defiance ever could. "Then show me," he said, stepping aside, giving her space, something he did not do lightly, and Mai moved forward with the same deliberate care as before, her steps measured, her presence gentle, as if she were entering a space that required respect rather than permission. She positioned herself beside the twins, not too close, not too distant, and for a moment, she said nothing, her silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, and Kang Ji-hyun watched, every instinct in him alert, every sense focused, waiting, and then she began, not with words this time, but with something, even quieter, a breath, steady and slow, as if she were aligning herself with something unseen, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same softness. But there was something deeper beneath it now, something rooted in memory rather than uncertainty. "I came back," she whispered, and the words seemed simple, almost insignificant, but they settled into the room in a way that made them feel larger than they were, and seconds passed. Long enough for doubt to rise again, long enough for logic to attempt to reclaim its place, until it happened, not all at once, not dramatically, but undeniably. One of the twins' lips parted slightly, not forming words, not yet, but breaking the stillness in a way that had never happened before, and Kang Ji-hyun felt his breath catch again, sharper this time, because this was not a coincidence, not a reflex, it was a response, small but real, and his eyes widened just enough to betray what he felt, surprise, disbelief, and something else, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, something fragile and dangerous. And as he stood there, watching a moment that no doctor had ever been able to create, he realized that whatever rules had governed this room before no longer applied, because the one person he had dismissed as invisible had just done what no amount of power, money, or influence had ever achieved. And for the first time, Kang Ji-hyun understood that control was not the same as connection, and that difference was about to change everything. The room did not return to silence the way it once had, because now the silence carried meaning. It was no longer empty, but filled with something fragile and alive, something that could disappear if handled too roughly, and Kang Ji-hyun stood there longer than he realized, his eyes fixed on the slight parting of his child's lips, replaying the moment in his mind, as if repetition could make it more real, more certain, because certainty had always been his foundation, and this was something else entirely, something that did not obey rules or patterns, something that required him to accept what he could not control, and that realization unsettled him in a way no threat ever had. His gaze slowly shifted to Mai, who remained beside the twins, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if what had just happened was not a miracle, but a continuation. And that difference was what held his attention. "You knew this would happen," he said quietly, not accusing, but searching, and she shook her head gently, her eyes still on the children. "Not like this," she replied, and there was honesty in her voice, the kind that did not try to impress or justify, only to state what was real. "Then how?" he asked, and this time the question carried something deeper, not just curiosity, but a need to understand something he had never considered before, and Mai hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because the answer did not belong easily in words. She took a slow breath, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the crib, not touching the children, but close enough to be present. "They are not empty, sir," she said softly, and the words settled into the room with quiet weight. "They are listening, they are feeling, they just cannot show it the way we expect." And Kang Ji-hyun felt something shift again, not in the room, but within himself, because for 2 years he had accepted the explanation that nothing was there, that what remained was only biology without awareness. And he had built his coping around that belief because it was easier, safer, less painful than imagining his children trapped in silence, aware, but unable to reach out. And now that belief was breaking, piece by piece, replaced by something far more difficult to face, the possibility that they had been there all along, waiting, unheard, and his jaw tightened slightly, not from anger, but from the weight of that realization. And for a moment, he said nothing because there was nothing he could say that would restore the simplicity he had lost. And then he moved, not abruptly, not with authority, but with something that resembled hesitation. He stepped closer to the crib, stopping just short, as if crossing that final distance required something more than movement. His hand lifted slightly, then paused in midair, the gesture incomplete, unfamiliar, because this was not how he approached problems, this was not how he engaged with the world. And yet here he was uncertain, and he glanced briefly at Mai, not for permission, but for understanding, and she gave a small nod, not instructing, not guiding, only acknowledging, and slowly, carefully, he lowered his hand, not gripping, not testing, only resting his fingers lightly against his child's hand, the contact so gentle it barely disturbed the stillness. And for a second, nothing happened, the old silence threatening to return, to reclaim its place, and then, almost imperceptibly, the tiny fingers beneath his shifted, curling just enough to meet his touch, and Kang Jae-hyun froze, completely still, as if any movement might break the connection. His breath held without intention. His entire focus narrowed to that single point of contact, because in that moment, for the first time since their birth, his child was responding to him, not to machines, not to procedures, but to him, and the realization struck deeper than anything else, not because of the movement itself, but because of what it meant. That connection had been possible all along, that presence had never been gone, only unreachable. And as he stood there, his hand still against his child's, he understood something that no amount of power had ever taught him, that control could build walls, but it could not create connection. And that lesson, quiet and undeniable, settled into him as the room fell into a new kind of silence, one that no longer felt empty, but full. The moment did not end when their fingers touched. It lingered, stretching into something neither of them had words for. And Kang Jae-hyun remained exactly where he was, his hand still resting against his child's, not daring to move, not daring to test whether the connection would hold if he shifted even slightly. Because for the first time in years, he was not trying to solve a problem. He was experiencing something, and that alone changed everything. His breath came slower now, more measured, as if his body was adjusting to a reality it had long been denied. And when he finally lifted his gaze, it did not go to the machines, not to the charts or the data he relied on for so long. It went to Mai, who stood quietly a few feet away, watching not with expectation, not with pride, but with a calm understanding that made the moment feel grounded rather than miraculous. And that difference mattered, because it told him this was not an accident, not luck, but something she understood in a way he did not yet. Teach me, he said, the words leaving him before he could reconsider them. And for a man who had never asked for instruction, who had built his life on being the one others listened to, the shift was unmistakable. Mai did not react with surprise. She did not step back or question him. Instead, she nodded once, small and certain, as if she had been waiting for that moment. Not because she expected it, but because she understood what it meant. And she stepped closer, not into his space, but beside it, positioning herself where she could see both him and the twins, her voice gentle but clear. Do not try to make them respond, she said, and the instruction was simple, almost too simple, but it carried weight because it contradicted everything he had done for 2 years. Every doctor, every treatment, every attempt had been built on forcing a response, measuring progress, demanding results, and now she was telling him to do the opposite, to let go of expectation, to be present without control. He frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in concentration, his mind adjusting to a framework that did not align with his instincts. Then what do I do? He asked, and there was no impatience in his tone, only focus. And Mai glanced at the twins again, her expression softening. You speak to them as if they can hear you, she replied, because they can, and the certainty in her voice made it difficult to dismiss, even for him. He hesitated for a moment, the words forming but not yet spoken, because this was unfamiliar territory. There were no scripts for this, no rehearsed commands, only presence. And slowly, he lowered himself into the chair beside the crib, his posture less rigid than usual, his hand returning to rest lightly against his child's, grounding himself in the connection that had already been proven. And for a moment, he said nothing, the silence stretching again. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt like space waiting to be filled. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had ever been. Not the voice that commanded rooms or ended conversations, but something else entirely. Something unguarded. "I am here," he said. The words simple, almost uncertain, and he watched not for immediate reaction, not for proof, but because he'd been told not to expect. And seconds passed, steady and unremarkable, until he felt it, a slight pressure against his fingers, not strong, not deliberate, but real, and his breath caught again, softer this time, because now he understood what to look for. Not dramatic change, not sudden transformation, but small, consistent signals that something was there, responding, connecting. And when he looked at Mai again, there was no need for explanation, because the evidence was no longer something he observed from a distance. It was something he was part of, and that realization settled into him with quiet force, changing not just what he believed about his children, but what he understood about himself. And as the room fell into that new, living silence once more, Kang Ji-hyun realized that for the first time, he was not trying to fix what was broken. He was learning how to reach what had always been there. The change did not fade with the passing of minutes. It deepened quietly, steadily, as if something long dormant had finally been given permission to exist, and Kang Ji-hyun remained seated beside the crib long after he would have normally left, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but grounded in something unfamiliar, something patient, his hand still resting lightly against his child's, no longer testing, no longer waiting for proof, but simply present, and that presence began to shape the room itself, the silence no longer pressing down, but opening, allowing space for something new to grow. And across from him, Mai observed without interruption, her role no longer that of someone stepping in where she did not belong, but someone guiding without control, offering without demanding. And for the first time since she had entered his world, she was not invisible. She was essential, not because of status or permission, but because of understanding. And as the minutes turned into something unmeasured, Kang Ji-hyun began to speak again, not with intention, not with strategy, but with something closer to instinct, telling stories he had never said out loud, about the city outside, about the changing seasons, about things that should have been ordinary, but had never found a place in his life, his voice low and steady, filling the room in a way that did not disrupt, but connected, and each time he paused, he felt it, the faint, consistent response beneath his fingers. Small movements, slight shifts, subtle signals that grew clearer the more he stopped trying to force them. And with each passing moment, something inside him continued to change, something that had been shaped by years of control and distance, now softening in ways he did not fully understand. Until finally, he stopped speaking, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he realized something else. He had been waiting for answers for 2 years, waiting for something external to fix what he could not reach. But the answer had not come from outside. It had come from a quiet voice, from presence, from listening, and that realization settled into him with quiet weight. He turned his head slightly, looking at Mai not as someone beneath him, not as staff, but as someone who had shown him something he could not have found on his own. "Why you?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying something deeper, not suspicion, not doubt, but genuine need to understand. And she held his gaze for a moment before answering, her expression calm, her voice steady. "Because I've seen this before," she said, and the words carried history, something unspoken but present. "I knew someone who could not move, who could not speak. Everyone said there was nothing there, that he could not hear, that he could not feel, but he could. He just needed someone to stay, to talk, to believe he was still there." And Kang Ji-hyun listened, not interrupting, not analyzing, because something in her voice made it clear that this was not theory, it was experience, and that difference mattered. He asked nothing further, because the answer he needed was already in front of him, in the small, undeniable responses from his children, in the connection he could now feel, and slowly he stood, not pulling away abruptly, but carefully, as if respecting the space he had just entered, his hand, lingering for a moment before releasing. And when he turned fully toward there was no distance left in his gaze, no coldness, only clarity from this moment on. He said, his voice steady but changed, "You will not be assigned to any other work. You will stay here, with them." And the words were not a command in the way they once would have been. They were a decision shaped by something deeper than control. And I nodded quietly, not surprised, not overwhelmed, only accepting, as if she understood that this was not an order, but a shift. And as Kang Ji-hyun walked toward the door, pausing just briefly before stepping out, he realized that the most powerful thing he had ever done was not something he commanded, but something he allowed, and behind him, in a room once defined by silence, something continued to grow, unseen but undeniable, something that no longer needed to be forced to exist. The days that followed did not bring sudden miracles or dramatic transformations. They brought something quieter, something far more difficult to measure, and yet far more real: consistency. And inside the once silent room at the top of Kang Jae-hyun's mansion, that consistency began to reshape everything. The machine still hummed. The light still fell softly across silk sheets and polished surfaces. But the stillness no longer felt like absence. It felt like waiting, and every morning, every evening, Mai was there, not performing, not searching for results, but simply present, speaking in that same calm, steady voice, telling stories, describing the world outside, naming small things most people never thought twice about: the sound of rain against glass, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the quiet rhythm of footsteps in a hallway, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the twins responded, not with words, not with movement anyone across the room could see, but with small, undeniable signals: a longer blink, a faint shift of fingers, the softest change in expression, and Kang Jae-hyun witnessed all of it. Not from a distance, not through reports or updates, but in person every day, sitting beside them longer than his schedule had ever allowed before. His presence no longer something that entered and exited the room with purpose, but something that remained, something that belonged. And with each passing day, he spoke more, not because he had learned how, but because he had stopped holding back, telling them things he had never said aloud, about who they were, about how long he had waited, about the silence he had mistaken for absence. And each time he spoke, he listened, not for answers he could measure, but for the subtle connection that had once been invisible to him. And it was there, always there, growing stronger, steadier, until one evening, as the city lights stretched across Seoul like a field of quiet stars, something happened that changed everything once again. Not suddenly, not loudly, but unmistakably. One of the twins' hands moved, not a reflex, not a brief response, but a deliberate reach, small but clear, and this time it did not stop there. The other followed, slower but certain, and Kang Ji-hyun froze, his breath catching in a way he no longer tried to hide, because this was no longer something fragile that might disappear. This was something real, something undeniable, and for the first time he did not look to confirm it. He did not question it. He simply accepted it, his hand meeting theirs without hesitation, his voice steady but filled with something new, something that had replaced the distance he once carried. "I am here," he said again, and this time, the response was not just felt, it was seen: a slight turn of the head, a shift that brought their gaze closer to his, not fully focused, not fully aware, but closer than they had ever been before, and the room fell into silence, not the old silence, not the empty one, but a full, living stillness that held meaning in every second. And across from him, Mai stood quietly, her presence unchanged, her role complete, not because the work was finished, but because the connection had been found. And as Kang Ji-hyun looked at his children, truly looked at them, he understood something that no power, no influence, no control had ever taught him: that dignity was not something you gave, it was something you recognized, something that existed even in silence, even in stillness, waiting for someone to see it. And that day, in a room once defined by absence, he finally did, and everything changed without a single word being spoken.